This afternoon, I want to take a few minutes to talk about what I call the nutrition hot buttons. One of those is the phrase which was in the program. And I apologize that my title is a little different than what was in the program, but that has to do with our ability to communicate and how well we did it. Many of you, if not all of you, have in recent years seen the following statement: "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." This statement is usually attributed to Hippocrates, the father of medicine. And we see it appearing today in articles and posters and social networking pieces, and it's just everywhere, even in some scientific articles. But I want to ask the question this morning, did Hippocrates really say this? And I want to suggest that we need to look at the evidence. In the 5th century BC, Hippocrates, of course, lived, worked, and today is considered to be the father of modern medicine. All of you who are physicians have taken the Hippocratic Oath. What we know about Hippocrates and in terms of history is found in 60 texts that are known as the Hippocratic Corpus. And in that he expounded at length about the theory of diet. But the phrase that we just had on the screen never appeared in any part of the Hippocratic Corpus. There is a researcher, and you see the references there. European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism in 2013 published a very interesting paper. And she used modern technologies of search and interviewed several of the experts in the world who are most familiar with the Hippocratic corpus, and they could not find this statement at all. Excuse me. Furthermore, Hippocratic medicine in that era valued and found diet relevant. And you only have to look at on regimen, and you can see that it's all about diet, as it was understood at that time. But Hippocratic doctors did not see food as medicine. They saw things very differently than even we do today. And food to them was that which is assimilated after digestion. So muscles and nerves and those things were part of body tissue. And they correctly viewed food as that which is digested and then assimilated into its individual components and then becomes part of the tissues of the body. But their view of medicine was very different than food. They saw medicine as a product, an external product, if you will, that could change the body's nature. And Hippocrates believed in the 4 humors of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that these medicines were able to change those natures, but not converted into the substance or the tissue of the body. And by attributing pharmacological properties to foods, I think we really confuse both food and medicine. So we need to be very cautious about using this statement, because it reflects a very different philosophy than what we understand today. And in deference to Miss Cardenas, I would like to suggest that today we need to let not thy food be confused with thy medicine. That was the title of her scientific paper. Let food be thy medicine is really a fabrication that was accepted worldwide on the iconizing of Hippocrates, and it appears to give moral and ethical sanction to this phrase. But it never appeared and was never used by Hippocrates. Though food and medicine have been highly related since Hippocrates' day, they were not conflated together as some scientists do today. And so we really do disservice when we try to merge them both or conflate them both into one clever sentence. They are really, by Hippocrates, were viewed differently, and I think today still need to be viewed very differently. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the nutrition hot buttons. And Seventh-day Adventists are well known for nutrition, and rightly so. We've been pioneers in many ways in the nutritional field, and we can lift our heads, hold our heads high as a result of that. But we also have some challenges in regard to diet. And I would like to ask the question now, why does the church recommend a healthy diet? Why should we even emphasize a diet as a church? We're really the only church in the world that has an emphasis on diet, certainly to the extent that we do as Seventh-day Adventists. So why should we emphasize it? A lady came up to me one time after a presentation at church, and she looked at me with a little bit of anger in her eyes, shaking her finger, and she said, "Do you believe in the second coming of Christ?" Well, how would you expect an Adventist pastor to answer that question? And she then told me that it really didn't make much difference how she chose to live or eat, because when Jesus came, she would be changed in a twinkling of an eye. Well, that's an interesting view. Many people today believe that if we would eat right and live right, we'd live longer. And there's evidence that points to that direction, without question. Others believe they'll have less disease. And there's evidence that points in that direction also, strongly. Some people simply want to live a healthy lifestyle because they feel better. And feeling better is wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe they want to accomplish more. But I would like to suggest that the real reason that God has given to his end-time people a message of health, which includes principles of healthy eating, is that he calls us to manage that which he has given to us as a gift, our health. Physically, we usually emphasize those things. By the way, I'm sorry, I got to talking without looking at my slides. I believe that he calls us to be stewards or managers of that which he has given to us, and health is one of those gifts. And health is a gift of physical strength and ability, and this is what we often emphasize the most. But health also involves our mental faculties. And we give a little bit of emphasis, and I'm glad we're giving a little more of that emphasis to that area, but it's still something that all of our members haven't really grasped. And then spiritually, our spiritual realm is also part of that gift. And today we really give very little emphasis between health and our spiritual decisions. And of course, social life is also a very important part of that which God has given to us. And our healthfulness, our ability to exist, think, and function influences tremendously our ability to interact socially with the world around us. Now, in our last session, and I ask forgiveness of those who were there, the last session on nutrition, but I want to the larger group to remind you of Isaiah 7, verse 14. Isaiah 7:14 says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Most of us have memorized that verse at some point in our lives. But rarely do we look at verse 15. And verse 15 simply says, "Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good." Now, in the days of the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness, they were looking for the promised land. And God described that promised land to them as a land filled with milk and honey. And when you look at the Hebrew root from which milk and honey is translated, and in the case of Isaiah here, curds and honey, we see that it is a Hebrew term that means adequacy and enough. Not only adequacy, but sustenance, support of sustenance. And I believe that what the prophet Isaiah is saying here is that curds and honey is what the Christ child would eat. He would provide for his needs physically and mentally and spiritually. But the most important part of this verse is explaining the reason why. He didn't say that he would live longer or that he'd live 10 years longer than anyone else. It simply said, the prophet simply said, so that he would be able to refuse the evil and choose the good. My friends, God has given us a health message and a nutrition message that supports the clear functioning of our brains. And those processes, the decision-making processes that come from it. The dividend is the physical benefits. The dividend is that we tend to live longer. Not everybody. We need to understand that. I have people say to me, well, I followed the health message, but now look at me. I'm 45 years old and I have cancer. God never promised that we would live forever or that we would live for X number of years in a healthy state. We live in a world of sin, unfortunately. But what we do know, and what science confirms, is that as we make healthy choices, we increase the risk or the odds of living longer. We decrease the risk of disease. And that's a tremendous blessing. But that's not the real reason for the health message. So what if you live to be 100 years old and all your relatives wished you had died when you were 60 because of your personality? You understand. God wants us to live a healthy life that we can demonstrate to the world in which we live, our families, our communities, the church, the love of Christ. And that we are living according to his principles, empowered by his grace. That's the real reason for the health message. Now I want to ask you another question. What is the rationale for choosing our dietary pattern? Today, we hear in the church that the only kind of dietary that will get us to heaven, I'm not sure there's any dietary that will get us to heaven, but that's what I hear. The only kind is a total vegetarian diet. Other people say, no, 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 it has to be a lacto-ovo. Others say it doesn't make any difference. What is the rationale for the reason we choose a particular dietary pattern? We have a long history in terms of dietary. And it's important, I think, as Seventh-day Adventists to understand what's going on, especially as that philosophy, certain philosophies, impact choices today. So my first question is, are we hygienic vegetarians? We're going to keep this in the context of a vegetarian diet. That means, do we choose to be vegetarians because of health? Or are we philosophical or theological vegetarians? There is a difference. Which one are we? Historically, Seventh-day Adventists have been hygienic vegetarians. We have not made diet a test of fellowship. We have been recommended by inspired counsel to follow a vegetarian diet. But we have never made that an absolute in the church. And there's good reasons for that. Now, out there in the world today, and actually at the very same time as the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, actually before the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, at the time of William Miller, in 1844, leading up to that, the first vegetarian society was formed in the city of London. And shortly thereafter, there was one in the United States. And when we read the history, we discovered, excuse me, that those who formed those societies had made some trips to India, and they had studied Hindu philosophy, and they had imbibed in the philosophy of the transmigration of the soul. And for those of you who may wonder what that is, it is simply a philosophy that says that if you earn enough karma in your life, if you've lived in appropriate ways, when you die, you will come back into a higher form of animal. But if you didn't earn enough, you'll come back into a lower form of animal. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you. I don't know if I caught this in Kruger Park from some wild animal. We have been here for over 10 days now in this country, and my wife and I had the privilege of being in Kruger last week, but I seem to have been struggling with a bit of a cold, and I apologize for that. Okay. So, in the philosophy of the transmigration of the soul, you really don't want to kill any animal because you don't know if it might have the soul, if you will, of a departed relative. And therefore you don't want to kill it and eat it. And that is, in simple terms, the philosophy behind the ethical vegetarian movement, or philosophical or theological. And we have a very different view. Seventh-day Adventists have a different view of a vegetarian diet. And we need to understand that view, and we need to make sure that we don't confuse ourselves or others with the philosophy, with a more worldly and secular philosophy. So I just want to plead with you. I strongly, and our whole department strongly recommends that we do not use the word vegan, because that word comes straight from Hindu philosophy. And we should go back to what we have historically referred to those who do not use any animal foods, any animal flesh, and they were called total vegetarians, And in my early days, even in my early nutrition training, we referred to it not as vegans, but as total vegetarians. I know it's a longer term, it doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily, but I would strongly suggest that as Seventh-day Adventists, we need to be careful that we don't be identified with a movement that does not have the love of Christ in it. In fact, and this was just one small illustration, that just immediately after the Las Vegas massacre that occurred here about 2 years ago, there was an avid vegan in the state of Pennsylvania who posted on her social networking venues that she was grateful that there were now 57 fewer carnivores in the world. Now, that is not an attitude of grace and the love of Christ. And we really don't want to be associated with that kind of philosophy. We need to understand where people, we need to love people, but we don't want to be associated with that kind of a philosophy. And I would strongly recommend that we do not use in our churches or in our ministries the term vegan. I think we will be embarrassed even more so in time. Now let me ask you a question. You're all very intelligent. Does a plant-based diet, can a plant-based diet include small amounts of meat, dairy, and eggs? How many of you would say that it can? Raise those hands higher. I'm having a hard time seeing them. All right, how many would agree that a plant-based diet does not include those foods? Maybe I also need to ask how many of you don't know. A plant-based diet, by definitions that are at least 20 years old, can include the use of meat, dairy, and eggs. Now that may come as a surprise to some of you. Let me read you, or let me show you a quotation from the American Dietetic, and as well as this is the American Dietetic Association and the Dietitians of Canada made this joint statement in 2014. Plant-based diets, defined as diets that include generous amounts of plant foods and limited amounts of animal foods. If you look at the 2012 textbook, which is a major textbook in nutrition in a good part of the world, Nutrition, Exercise, and Behavior, a plant-based diet is not necessarily a vegetarian diet. Many people on plant-based diets continue to use meat products and or fish, but in smaller quantities. And so I would like to suggest to you that as Seventh-day Adventists, we need to have a little thought adjustment, if you will, and recognize that the term plant-based diet is not the same as a vegetarian diet. Now, a plant-based diet can include, it's a big umbrella actually, and it can include total vegetarian as well as, or vegan, and I've put that in parentheses just for identity purposes. It can include lacto-ovo or ovo-lacto-vegetarian diets, flexitarian diets, semi-vegetarian diets, pesco-vegetarian diets. The definition or the defining part of a plant-based diet is that plants are the foundation of the diet, plant foods. But it can include other things as well. It is not equal. Plant-based diet does not equal a vegetarian diet. And I think here too, we need to have clarity of thought and recognize that what indeed a plant-based diet means by definition, and not try to massage the meaning into a total vegetarian diet, as there are some who would like to do. Now we're moving from one hot button to the other, and I probably should have put that hot button icon on each of these items, but I'd like to ask you a question. Is there a diet for a lifetime? I had somebody ask me that, and they asked me this way: what diet can I eat to prevent all disease? And I had to answer them: there really is no diet to prevent all disease. And unfortunately, that's true. Sometimes we like to be very reductionist, and we like to be very simplistic. And it's important to make things simply understood. But those of you who are physicians here know that if you take a sharp knife, known as a scalpel, and you press it with sufficient pressure against the skin, you will create a wound. And it will bleed if the person is alive. Now that's a very simple principle. But on the other hand, most of us today, and I see that, as we were talking this morning about the Breathe Free plan, Breathe Free 2 plan, and I was showing them how to sign up, they were sitting there on their cell phones applying to be facilitators. In fact, I think we got about 16 applications during the lecture, and it was all done on cell phones. Now, if I drop this cell phone, let go of it, it's going to fall. And chances are it could break, or at least a part of it could break. It's amazingly indestructible, but still, it's a remarkable instrument. And it's designed by thousands and thousands of people who creatively brought about the technology and compressed it and put it into something like this. You know, for those of you who are my age, you can remember when there was discussion of computers. And you may have remembered the time when somebody made a statement that there would come a time when every household would have a computer. And we looked at that, and I remember hearing that and saying, nah, that couldn't happen in my lifetime. Computers were only great big machines that resided in huge rooms, took a tremendous amount of power and cooling to make them function. And yet today, almost all of us carry in our pockets a cell phone that has more power than any of those computers that were in those huge rooms, and can carry out many, many-fold more calculations per second than any of those older computers could. Not only are our phones telephones, they're computers. They're really a telephone and a computer in a small device. They are incredibly complex, and yet they are very, very simple in comparison to God's creation that we call the human body. And when we talk about disease, we need to realize it's very complex. And in biology, there's always a large number of steps in the chain of events that lead to the final result. And that's the case with most diseases. I can ask you a question. If you smoke cigarettes, will you get lung cancer? Most people who smoke don't get lung cancer. Say, wait a minute, what's going on? If you eat an unhealthy diet, will you get sick? Not always. I know that's confusing. If you consume a healthy diet, will you never get sick? No, unfortunately. We live in a complex and confused, sin-filled world. And there are people who live and eat as they wish with abandon, and they seem to live a long time. And there are people who live very carefully who don't live as long. So what's going on? Disease is not a simple model of causation. We have to look much deeper. Most diseases today are the result of a long series of mutations in genes that are vital in supporting the integrity of thousands of other genes. Disease can be caused by complex interactions between the environment in which we live, between our diet, our physical activity, the amount of sleep we get, even our thoughts and our attitudes can influence the causation of disease. So does nutrition and lifestyle really make a difference? I would answer that question with absolutely. But maybe not in the way you were thinking of it. There's a little game called dominoes that is played around the world. It's made up of little chips that are painted, usually black, with some white dots on them and different combinations. And when I was a kid, we had a set of dominoes at home, and I loved to line those up on the linoleum on the floor, make different patterns. And then my sister, who was 2 years younger, would often, just before I finished, come along and push on one of those at the end, and it would cause all of what I had done to collapse. You know what that's like? Probably some of you have done that. Well, these are not pictures of dominoes, but they're very similar to little wood chips. And if you took and tied one of those chips with the string down to the bottom, to the ground, if you would, when one falls against it, it stays standing. And healthy lifestyle is very similar to tying up a chip. What it does is it reduces our risks, but it doesn't take them all away. We need to understand that. Today we, as Seventh-day Adventists, often refer to the original diet as if that was some perfect diet that would allow eternal life, even here on this earth. And of course, we know where the original diet came from in Genesis 1:29 and then later in Genesis 3:18. But do we really know what kind of food, what kind of nutrients were in the original diet? I don't think we do. We know basically what the foods are, and as Seventh-day Adventists, it's easy for us to describe those kinds of foods as fruit, whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and nuts and seeds. Those terms just flow off of our tongue. They're just part and parcel of who we are as Seventh-day Adventists. And those things were no doubt there in the Garden of Eden. But there was also a tree of life. And we have no idea what nutrients the tree of life, the fruit from the tree of life had. We know there were major changes that took place when sin entered this world. Major changes in nature, in humans, and probably in our food sources. But nevertheless, nutrition authorities today agree that using plant foods as the foundation of our meals is the very best. Eating a variety of grains, especially whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, is the basis of healthy eating. And now I think you know the answer to this next question. But some of you may find this a bit difficult to understand. But just before the last General Conference session, I received a 80-page handwritten letter that was addressed to me, filled with quotations, good quotations, making an appeal that I should take to the floor of the General Conference session. Did not understand the whole process, I realize that. A motion, and this is what the motion said. Those Seventh-day Adventist members who use any flesh foods, eggs or milk, should be disfellowshipped. I didn't even show that to you, Peter. You know what I did with it. It reflects the thinking of some of our brothers and sisters. And I'm sad to say that. But is vegetarian diet a test of fellowship? It is not. And don't let anybody tell you it is. What is the position of the church? If we look at the fundamentals, and this is from what is often on the baptismal vow, number 22 on Christian behavior. It says, along with adequate exercise and rest, we are to adopt the most healthful diet possible and abstain from the unclean foods identified in scriptures. That's as granular and explicit and as explicit as it gets. If we look at Seventh-day Adventists believe, it says the diet God ordained in the Garden of Eden, the vegetarian diet, is the ideal. But sometimes we cannot have the ideal. And in those circumstances and in any given situation or locale, those who wish to stay in optimum health will eat the best food that they can obtain. A very balanced statement. It's not as prescriptive as some might like it to be. If we look at the church manual, or the working policy on page 303, we see the church advocates the positive steps be taken to develop a healthful lifestyle and encourages a balanced vegetarian diet. And then if you go down another sentence, it says the church encourages the avoidance of flesh foods. But nowhere does it say we force those choices on our members. We need to keep that clearly in our mind. And when we do, it will make us loving health reformers and nutrition educators. And that's what God wants. Probably the hottest question, if you will, in the church today is simply, is a total vegetarian diet for everyone? And I find everywhere I travel in the world, there are discussions on this topic. And it doesn't, I mean, it's true here too, and it was clear in our class this afternoon. I would like to suggest that we must always take a global perspective because we are a global church. And so we need to consider the availability of fortified foods and the affordability of those fortified foods, the ability to implement healthy dietary changes, and that's a very complex one. It's attainable, but it is not one that happens overnight, and it isn't something that people can say suddenly they can change their entire life dietary. It takes education, it takes practice, it takes experience, and it takes knowledge. And we have an obligation as a church to provide those things for those who would choose to do so. That's why we are health educators. It also depends on the availability of quality supplements. And vitamin B12 is certainly one of those. And for those of you who were in the class this afternoon, you know how clearly I stated that if you don't have any dietary source of vitamin B12, you need to take a supplement. And you need to make sure that that supplement is indeed what it says it is. because there are analogs that are on the market. They're cheap. And unfortunately, unscrupulous providers mark them as B12, but they have no biological activity in the human body. And we need to make sure that we're getting truly what we are paying for and intending to take. And then, of course, we need to look at the affordability of supplements. There are portions of the world where that's not, where supplements are not affordable for the average person. So we always need to take this global perspective, and we also need to understand the level of food knowledge that the population we're working with has. So those are things that I think are essential when we seek to answer that question: is a total vegetarian diet for all people? Now, I'm going to make a recommendation here that, based upon the studies that we don't have time to look at them this afternoon, that so far a vegetarian diet or total vegetarian diet looks very good. And these are the results from the Adventist Health Study 2, which is still ongoing. The data is getting quite robust. Well, we're still, as I told the group this afternoon, waiting for a few people to die. We can't finish the study until they do. And probably none of you are involved, so I can't invite you to die prematurely to hasten our understanding of the studies. Oh, you're in it, but we don't want you to die. I'm in it too, and so is my wife. So we don't want that to happen. But it is not convincingly superior to a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet. The evidence right now is sufficient to support a whole plant-based diet. And when I say whole plant-based, what I'm meaning is, there are some people who choose to leave off all the animal products, but then they eat all kinds of desserts and high-fat, high-sugar foods that just don't have any animal in them. And that is not healthy. So that's why I have stated a whole plant-based diet. But it may still include some lacto-ovo foods, but they should be used in moderation as condiments. Otherwise, a plant-based or that diet should be plant-based or trend strongly in that direction. And I think the evidence is very clear today that it should avoid all red meat and poultry. And when you look at the data, it's very strong in that direction. So, for those who are interested in a total vegetarian diet, let me make a few suggestions, or an animal-free diet, if you will. Number one, you need to ensure that you're eating ample grains, whole grains, vegetables, legumes, fruits, nuts, seeds, and berries. Secondly, you need to avoid replacing animal foods with refined, sweet, fatty commercial products, even if they are from plant sources. Somebody the other day told me that they just love soy ice cream. And I said, could you bring me the container? And so they did. And I said, have you ever looked at the label? They looked at the label and they said, I guess I shouldn't be eating as much of it as I am. I said, well, I'm glad you have educated yourself. It was vegetarian, without question. It was animal-free. And it was delicious, according to them. But it wasn't necessarily healthy. Now, a small amount from time to time, I have no problem with that. We need to be balanced and moderate in things. But this person was eating one container every day. Third, we need to take a supplement of vitamin B12 regularly. It needs to be truly vitamin B12. If not, we need to find dietary sources of vitamin B12. Some eggs and some milk used as condiments can provide the necessary B12 in the diet. And then we need to obtain adequate sunlight and emphasize high calcium vegetables, or we need to supplement with calcium. I think those are the four most important suggestions for those who choose to be animal-free in their diets. Now, there are unhealthful total vegetarian diets, and I'm going to skip that slide because we're running out of time. But I want to conclude with a burden and a concern that I have. I have traveled around the world, many different places, been in many churches, and I find, unfortunately, that our churches are filled with food wars. I don't know why. I have a few ideas. I have never seen a church that quarreled over amount of exercise. I have never seen a church that quarreled over how much sleep one should have. But food, it seems like it's a virus that has spread around the world. And I believe these potluck wars do more damage to more people than we have really imagined. And we should stop this nonsense that is going on today before more collateral damage is done. Let me tell you a very quick story. I preached at a little church in the United States. They invited me to the potluck, went downstairs to this fellowship hall. There was a lady who was very much in charge of that potluck, and sometimes that's good. In this case, she was trying to be in charge of too much. And she asked me to come to the front of the line, and she finally asked me to give the blessing, and I did that. And I thought, I'll stand back, let the children go, eat first. They're hungrier than I am. But as I opened my eyes, she held a plate in front of my hand. And at that point, I realized there was no sense fighting it. And as I took the plate, she took her bony finger, and she pointed at the first dish on the table, and she said, "This dish has real cheese in it." I had no idea who had made that dish, but everybody heard it in that room. Unfortunately, it was a dish that is not my favorite. I just don't care for that particular dish. But I wondered what I should do. And I felt impressed that I should take one small spoonful of it. It was vegetarian, but it had cheese. And everybody was now looking at what I was taking. And when I took one small spoonful and put it on my plate, this lady went, "Oh!" And everybody heard that as well. Now everybody was watching what I took. Now the table was filled with many good choices, and I filled my plate with good food, and I sat down, and we had a wonderful time of fellowship as we ate together. Potluck was over, and I was heading out the door into the hallway, and I noticed across the hall there was a lady standing there, and there were tears coming down her cheeks. And there was no pastor, no head elder, nobody seemed to be around. And so I walked toward her, and I said, "Is there something I can do to help you, ma'am?" And she began to cry more. And she told me that she was the lady who had made that dish with real cheese. And through her tears, she told me that this was the third time that this very thing had happened to her, and that she had been baptized 4 weeks before. She told me that she had told her husband in the morning that if this happened again, she would never come back to church. But she said, "You took one small spoonful, and I watched you, and you ate it." I invited her to come upstairs to where there was a foyer, sit down in a chair, and we visited a little bit, prayed with her. And on the way home, I called her pastor, and I said, "You've got a problem." Told him about it. He said he and his wife would deal with it. About 1.5 years later, I had the chance to talk to that pastor. And he told me that indeed that evening he and his wife had gone to visit her and her husband. They'd invited her to their home. His wife had given her some cooking lessons. He had given her another series of Bible studies, including studies about the health message in a very balanced way. And he said to me, "The good news is that today she is in charge of potluck." and she's doing a wonderful job. But he said the best news is that in just a few weeks ago, he said, I baptized her husband. I said, praise the Lord. We need to be really careful. We need to understand that a particular dietary is not the standard of fellowship in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I would like to suggest to you this evening that we must love people more than we love the health message. I love the health message. I think you do too. But we really need to love people. We need to know where they are. We need to show them the grace and love of Christ. And we need to do that on a consistent basis. And when we do, we will accomplish the work that God desires for each of us and for our movement in these last days in the area of health reform and the health message. Let's not deform it. Let's amplify it with the love of Jesus. That's my prayer this evening.